Buddy, and welcome to this month's OPSWAT Academy webinar. Today we're going to be talking about fortifying the unknown. We're going to be talking about zero-day threats, how they happen, and some techniques we can use to protect ourselves and our organizations against them. Please note that this is a interactive session, so if you have some questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I'll be looking at that periodically to talk to you guys and answer any questions that you have. Today, we're going to be looking at zero-day threats using one of OPSWAT's solutions, MetaDefender Core. This is going to allow us to visualize how zero-day threats enter organizations, how they're executed, and what we can do to use OPSWAT technologies to protect ourselves against those kinds of threats. So to get started, I'm going to share my screen and share a part of a PowerPoint presentation here. Let's look at entire screen. And we'll move this off to the side. Let's see if this pops up. Hmm. Still loading. There we go. Okay. I got a question about receiving a digital certificate for this webinar. We do not give certificates for the webinars directly. However, at the end of this webinar, we will be providing a special promo code that you can use to access OPSWAT Academy courses at 75% off. Completing those courses will allow you to earn OPSWAT Academy certifications as well. So it's kind of like an indirect way to get your certifications from OPSWAT at a heavily discounted price. So stay tuned for the special promo code at the end of the webinar. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen as it is without the full presentation mode, so I can control these slides a little easier here. I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of threats that exist with malware. And what do we mean when we're talking about zero-day threats? I hope you all can see my screen. It's looking like it's a little dimmed, but I will continue. Is the screen look dim to anybody else in the audience? Oh, and for how many courses can we take with the promo code? It's all the associate courses are available. Okay. All right. Well, as long as the presentation is good for you guys, that's all that matters. So on this slide, we are looking at malware, emerging and known threats, and zero-day and unknown threats. So what do we mean by that? Ultimately, we can classify all kinds of malware within these two categories. And within these two categories, we have different mechanisms and different strategies that we use to detect or prevent those kinds of threats. Emerging and known threats, the strategies we use today has been in use for a very long time. Antivirus engines or anti-malware engines, essentially, the companies themselves create their own R&D facilities where they discover, log, and categorize malware, and then compile those lists of detections into essentially databases that allow these antivirus uh, endpoints, antivirus running on your endpoint or antivirus engines, if you will, that we use in our products to essentially compare a list of existing known malware components, files, and software to that existing list that was already developed by those antivirus companies. So this means that the process of detecting malware and being able to log it inside that antivirus engine does have some time delay between those two instances. You can imagine that if new malware was released in the wild, there is a period in time in which those antivirus companies need to detect, categorize, and then update their endpoints to be able to compare that known list that known object to the list and find the detection. There are downsides to it, being the fact that there is that time delay. The big upside is that processing malware this way requires very little compute power. And that's why we refer to this as static analysis. So, hold on, getting some notes here. Let's see if I can make this slide full. Let me reshare one moment. Okay. And I'll reshare my screen into full screen mode so you guys can see it a little easier. And I can go through the animations. And this way, this gives you some animations as well. Okay, so we are here talking about emerging and known threats. And this way I can cycle through the animations as we go through. So hopefully you all can see that a little easier now. So we're talking about emerging and known threats. With this process, we're able to have a static analysis process to detect these kinds of threats. This means that we can compare the known list of malware objects to a database of sorts, and we call that signature definitions. And with static analysis, we're doing that through matching. That's the whole point. You can imagine that in these antivirus companies, they're making a list and they're seeing objects that are presented to the software and they're matching against that list. Another practice that we can do is through reputation. And reputation is generally community and company driven feedback for whether malware is truly malware, either on a false positive or a false negative. And a false positive being a file or software that's detected as malicious when in fact it actually is legitimate. And likewise, there could be a file or software that truly is malicious, but something about the detection process is not allowing that to fully be detected. So, by providing reputation mechanisms that we at OPSWAT have uh, our own reputation engines to apply to these services, we can have a tandem of very fast and very effective static analysis processes. And that static analysis is the big word here because when we're talking about the workflows going in and out of an organization, there could be emails, internet traffic, all kinds of data that are being processed, even data analysis. And if we're going to create a security process to be able to facilitate scanning that content for malware, we need to be able to do it quickly and effectively. And that's why the static analysis matching technique works very well. Where things get a little harder to implement and require a little more creativity, if you will, is when we start talking about the concept of 0 day and unknown threats. And as we already outlined a little bit through the process in which an antivirus company creates these lists, we've already established that there is a period in time in which malware may exist in the wild before it is discovered and categorized. Now, when that's the case, if you happen to be the subject of an attack from this newly released malware, that's when we call it a 0 day attack. And that's when malware can enter an organization completely undetected and wreak havoc before it's found, discovered, and the objective of the attacker is fulfilled. So, what can we do? What can we do to protect ourselves from 0 day and unknown threats? Well, that's when we have to have alternative technologies. One that you may have heard before is through analysis, and that's through sandboxing. Sandboxing is when we execute a file inside of a secured virtualized environment, usually, where the file is detonated, is the terminology often used. Essentially, the file is executed to do what it was intended to do. And by allowing the file to carry out its actions, the real technology in a sandbox software is really the ability to analyze every little action that that file is trying to do. Is it trying to call out to an external IP? Are those external IPs on any lists for uh, known malicious sites? Is it trying to alter the registry for a Windows system? Is it trying to call a subprocess and call the shell, for example? And all of these things can be discovered by letting the file do what it was designed to do. The challenge with modern sandboxes is that malware is getting more sophisticated. It's able to know that it's in a virtualized environment and have conditions to not execute the intended payload of whatever it was coded to do. That makes it very difficult to know for certain that when we execute a file in a sandbox environment, especially when we're processing many files, that we're getting the full result. And that's why in a later demonstration, when we go through this, the OPSWAT sandbox uses file emulation technology rather than um, full virtualization, which means that the file is essentially walked through whatever it's coded to do, despite the conditions, so that the full analysis process can be executed on the total pathways of the file, which is fantastic. Another thing that we can do is through alteration, also known as sanitization. Essentially, we're giving back a different file than the one that was received. And the file that we give back is a file in a known safe state. And this technology that we'll demonstrate shortly is through deep CDR. And CDR stands for Content Disarm and Reconstruction. We call it deep CDR because our technology is capable of recursively going down into a file and sanitizing all of the elements within that file and fully rebuilding it back into a usable state. This uses less resources than sandboxing. It's generally quicker, but you can't don't always have a situation where you can have an alternate version of a file. Sometimes there might be legal implications in which that you have to have the same file that you started with. So it's good to have multiple approaches to handle content as well. Also, even with both of these solutions with 0-day and unknown threats, there is that metric of what does the data flow look like? What are we expecting for our total volume of the files of our organization? If we could sandbox analysis everything, then that'd be a perfect world. But oftentimes, intercommunications and data transferring doesn't really work that way. We don't have the luxury to detonate and scan everything, even if we had the compute resources to do so. So we have to define, as cybersecurity professionals, when is the most appropriate time to use the appropriate solutions and technologies based on the use case, based on the flow of data, and based on the requirements as well. So we'll go through a couple examples of what that really means from the perspective of how can I implement as much security as possible given the circumstances in the situation. Now, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between 0 days and vulnerabilities. Oh, and another important term is that this is known as dynamic analysis or dynamic actions, if you will. Sandboxing is dynamic because you're always going to get something different based on the file that you put in, because every file is going to do a different action. And CDR is also dynamic because you're always getting a different file than what was put in as well. So we can call these dynamic processes. And the fact that they're dynamic means that they require more compute resources to fulfill. Let me just take a moment here to check for questions. There's a question if there's a recording of the webinar. Yes, all of our webinars are recorded, and you'll get an email for signing up and joining with the link to the recording page as well. Let's see. So I got a question at the bottom. When a kiosk misses a couple of files used in offensive security, what would be the best approach to identify them when VirusTotal can detect it? Oh, that's a really good question. So why would kiosk miss a couple files? Well, let's talk a little bit about what kiosk is. For those of you that aren't familiar, kiosk is an OPSWAT product that communicates with MetaDefender Core, which is the analysis product that we have, to scan files against a series of antivirus engines, antivirus companies, to give overall results for USB sticks or other kinds of removable media. It's essentially a stand where you plug in a USB and it scans files. So, what's happening with detection rates is that those are dependent on the antivirus company engines that we are using. And actually, I think that this is a good opportunity to pull up the demo VM that I have here for you guys. Let me see if I can get this going. Okay. Let's make this bigger. It does not like this resolution change. One moment. All right. Okay. There we go. There we go. Okay. So let's pull up this. I might have to change the resolution because I can barely see the text. Let's change the scale. It's a little better. Maybe I can make it even bigger. Let's go to 250. This way, hopefully you can read what's going on. Okay, that should be pretty good. Okay, so I'll go ahead and sign in. This is our MetaDefender Core platform. This is what we use to scan and analyze files. All of our solutions, all of our file analysis solutions essentially communicate with this platform in order to do the multi-scanning, CDR, DLP, all of our components. So we're logging into this interface here, and I'm going to show you the multi-scan component to talk about the detection rates. This is running on a local VM within my laptop as well, so it should should be able to handle what I'm trying to display here. So we'll go to inventory. All right. So as you can see here, this is showing 4 antivirus company engines that are included in this instance of Metadefender Core. And in production environments, usually you're seeing a minimum of 8 of these. I'm running a 4 engine package here because I'm essentially running this on an underpowered virtual machine for this demonstration. But you can imagine that you'd see at least 8 antivirus engines here on this particular platform. And the deployments of Metadefender Core go up to more than 30 antivirus engines. These are McAfee, ESET, um, uh, ClamAV. Oh, you see those here. But there's 30 antivirus companies essentially that are being used to scan files essentially all at the same time to give a compiled result of the analysis of that file. And if you have something like VirusTotal, which does a similar action, what antivirus engines are being used for that instance? So you can have a deployment of Metadefender Core or kiosk, if you will, that's connecting to 8 engines. And then you can have another kiosk sitting right next to it that's using a core instance that has 30 engines. And the whole point of adding more engines is so that you, the user, have that higher chance of detection rates. We're comparing the processes between these engines themselves to give ourselves the best overall result. So remember back when we discussed a little bit about the process of adding malware to that list, to that database, those signature definitions. You can actually see here in this column, this is the database. This is the signature definitions of malware. And each company has their own process in which they discover and catalog malware. So it's entirely possible that malware is released and only 1 or 2 companies are able to update their engines within the first week of that malware existing or being used for attacks. So by relying just simply on one antivirus solution, you're missing out on all of that effort that all the other antivirus companies are putting into their detection processes. So the whole point of the entire multi-scan process is so that we don't miss those potential gaps from the antivirus companies. We're getting the best of all the worlds of their processes because it might be a big name company that detects something first, but it might be a smaller company. It just depends on how they receive the sample and what their update process is like in getting that to the definitions. So if you're running a kiosk and it has, let's say, an end engine package, those 8 antivirus engines may not be updated in time or as recently to scan a file, or maybe they would just treat a file differently compared to, uh, VirusTotal, for example, or even our solution with a full engine package, right? Because it's the individual decisions of the antivirus companies that are giving you a cumulative response. So kiosk is subject to how many antivirus engines or companies, if you will, you're communicating with at any given time. So keep that in mind. And that's a really good perspective too, going into 0-day threats, because that sample in your question might be a false positive, but it might be an official malware sample. And if it's a newly released sample in 1 week, 2 weeks, are all antiviruses going to register that? If it really is a true malware sample, then that's probably the case. So you're seeing the advantage of comparing to more antivirus engines rather than just relying on a few. And that's the entire theory behind multi-scan. So we always push for our customers to try to license as many as they can because they're going to get the biggest benefit from that static analysis process. And mind you, this is still static analysis. It's making the best out of the static analysis situation. And the situation being that we have to rely on these companies to do their research and update their databases before we run into the threat that they're cataloging. And we're subject to that speed. And that's just an inherent downside of the static analysis process. But by combining everything into a single set, into a full set for a single file, a full result, we can give ourselves a better chance of using those guys that are connecting early. Does the license determine the number of engines? Does license matter provided for a POC compared to a normal enterprise license? Yes. So if you're evaluating Metadefender Core, you can evaluate actually at different POC engines, so you can get a sense of that. But importantly, uh, yes, the license itself comes in a variety of deployments: 8, 16. Um, I think 24 is the next one, and then we also have additional engines that can be added on top, some customized ones as well. I believe the max number for on-prem deployments is 32. But it's a large list of antivirus engines. All right. So licensing and product aside, we're going to be using the product to actually demonstrate zero-day files and zero-day threats. So it's not always the fact that there's just that time delay between a malicious file being detected and being put in this database where where we can actually get a result and hit and actually block the file. Sometimes it's just the nature of the file itself. A really good example, and we'll do a demo here, is macros in Office documents. I will run a quick example that we have here. And I'll pull it here on my desktop so we can see it. Oh, I do not want to add it to my VM. Okay. Well, I'll just run it. I'll run it straight from here because it's trying to put it in my VM and I don't want that. Let's see. It's hanging a little bit. Give me a second. Okay. Okay. We'll run this open calc with macro XLSX, or excuse me, XLS. It's not the XLSX version. This is simply a XLS file that has a macro embedded in it. And you can see there's text here. This is: the content of this page was encrypted. Please click enable content to the above message. This is not an encrypted document. That's just misleading text because what we want to do is trick the person into clicking this enable content button. And by running the enable content button, it popped up in my other screen, actually, it launched the calculator app all on its own. So this was run, popped up, and executed on my screen. And that's because we gave this file permission to do so when we clicked that uh, enable editing button. That unlocked the macro was able to run, and it called the file, or it called the executable to launch the calculator. Now, this is a benign action. It's not going to cause any harm to my machine. This is just a sample. But essentially, what's happening in this file is that macro is running a Visual Basic script that's calling to launch the calculator application. And the point is that that script could be used to really do anything on the system, and that's how we have these entry points for malicious attacks. Now, I think this particular example may be flagged by malware or by the antivirus engines. But let's walk through another one before we start processing these. This is another example. I'll show it on the VM actually. We'll go to test files. And we'll run this PDF file. It's a very similar kind of action with this file. You can see the PDF file opens, it's loading, and I get another pop-up. Now, it does say an embedded page on this page says that's the default warning, uh, but we have our own custom note here. Right now, we're saying that we're doing something um, particularly benign. This is about to insert the date field now. This message could be anything. So it's, click OK to see the content or anything of that nature. I'm giving a user permission input here, and you can see that this field is updated with the date. This was run using an embedded JavaScript. So it's the same kind of concept with by giving the user permission, code on this file is executing and running. And this really can be used to do many harmful things to your system. So we have these examples of files doing things we really weren't expecting them to do just by editing or clicking an OK button, both of which are executing either Visual Basic or JavaScript. So let's run through an example of what happens when we scan a file like this. Now let me go through and make sure that my workflow is set up for this. Right now I'm going to turn off both of those dynamic analysis components that I spoke about earlier so that we can just see what the static analysis process tells us. So we're going to be scanning this against 4 anti-malware engines. Let's first try the calculator. And you can see that none of these engines detected it as a threat, even though there was an embedded macro. Why? Well, macros themselves aren't classified as just enough to be malicious. People use macros all the time to help with productivity or have particular functionality in their files. And that's also true with uh, embedded JavaScript into uh, PDF files. And even if they were, if we created something on our own that's not copy and paste from some known code base somewhere, then even heuristic analysis, which is essentially a smaller window viewpoint of static analysis in files, would have trouble detecting that as well. So we should see something similar to the PowerPoint, excuse me, the PDF when we scan it. And there's no threat detected here either. And we know this is a problem because we know that these files have a potential to be malicious. And as we spoke about earlier, there's essentially 2 ways that we can protect ourselves from somebody injecting a Visual Basic script that does some harmful things to our organization. So let's talk about the first one, in which we'll look at deep CDR. So for this example, we will go back to our workflow and enable deep CDR. And let me just make sure my file type is selected. It should be. Adobe files. And let's also do XLS. Okay, we are all set. So let's go ahead and process the, let me save changes. Let's process our PDF. So we process the PDF. You can see that there's still no hit, which is fine. But now we have this new option, this new item here, deep CDR. And it actually tells you that there are things removed from the file. Some JavaScript was removed, document open action, a form field. So let's download this altered version and open this file. And you can see that I didn't get a prompt and that the date field is no longer today's date. That's because the JavaScript that was used to update this field, just by clicking that OK button, is no longer on this file. And importantly, outside of this action, the file is exactly the same as the original. And that's the magic of the reconstruction process of deep CDR. You're still getting the same file back, just with the removed potentially malicious components. We're removing the threat surface area, the threat vectors of those files as well. And the same can be true for the Excel file. But before we run the Excel file through here, let's talk a little bit about the secondary item with sandboxing. So we can go back to our workflow and we can go to the sandboxing section. And we'll make it so that this is going to analyze the file that we scan. There's multiple settings we could do. We could choose to run the sandbox on all files that are allowed. That gives us a zero trust methodology, saying I'm going to drop everything that the antivirus finds, and then anything that's allowed, I'm going to scan with sandbox. But that requires lots of compute power and time, so it has to make sense in that particular workflow. Or you could use sandbox as an additional deep dive analysis process as well. So let's run sandbox with this calculator macro. And this is going to give us a good representation of how sandbox really does add that additional layer when static analysis isn't going to detect certain elements. So sandbox is running. We can expect this to take around 30 seconds or so. And let's take a look at some messages here. Yes, so there's a question about what today's topic. We're talking about zero-day threats and what we can do to protect against them. So zero-day threats versus known threats. What are some technologies that we can use to allow ourselves to protect against the unknown? And ultimately, we're looking at two technologies for CDR and sandboxing. And it does look like my virtual machine is not having it right now because it definitely should be done by now. We can look at a previous scan result, fortunately. Oh, it finished. Okay, great. So this is a excellent representation of why sandboxing is extremely useful even if your antiviruses tell you there's no threat. Because the actions of this macro are representing what a hacker would do to embed that Visual Basic script to call a subprocess on the system. So you can see here, none of my antivirus engines detected this file as a threat. However, through sandboxing, it found multiple suspicious and even a malicious mechanism associated with this file. So by adding that next layer of dynamic analysis to the static analysis process, we're providing a true zero trust workflow now. Now, this challenge still arises of when it's applicable to be able to have the time to run sandbox in every file. So we need to make sure that the most critical secure elements or elements and workflows and data workflows of our organization that are capable of having this slightly longer analysis process that we're using not just static analysis but also dynamic analysis. Let me check for questions. So no audio and video, but I think that that might be, if you're having issue with the audio and video, you can try leaving the session or refreshing the page, leaving the session, because I do think we are streaming correctly here. So how do these zero-day threats, how are they created in the first place? Well, there's a huge correlation between zero-day threats and vulnerabilities. So let's talk a little bit about vulnerabilities next. And I have a previous scan result here that we'll take a look at. Okay, so I got a question before we look at this. I'll go ahead and pull it up so that's ready, but then I'll answer your question. So the question is unrelated to what's on the screen right now. The question in the chat is: so would Sandbox be the best approach when Kiosk misses those files? And the best answer is absolutely. Um, as a security professional, I would tell you you want to perform as much analysis processes as possible. The challenge becomes when you have to make sure that there's time allowed. Because if I have an external hard drive that I'm plugging into Kiosk, that's very different than walking up to Kiosk with a USB with 10 files on it. That external hard drive could have tens of thousands of files on it. So we will be there for a very long time to sandbox and analyze everything. But importantly, the sandbox analysis process that is embedded with Metadefender Core or communicating with Metadefender Core also has triage capabilities to decide what kind of analysis that file should be taking to reduce the overall time as well. So in our previous analysis, we can actually go into the settings. We can take another look at workflows. If we want to reduce that scan time, we could go into our sandbox settings. And I realized that I also didn't have rapid mode enabled. So we need to enable rapid mode to increase the time. And we can change the scan mode to either smart or triage mode to give us those results sooner. So let's go ahead and just see if that makes a difference. The last one was 69 seconds. This is on AVM, so the overall times are not truly representative of the real world, but it should make an impact on our virtual machine. And we're going to scan this through Sandbox once again. But the point is, oh, there we go. So we didn't get as full of a result, as you can see. Now we got the suspicious instead of the full malicious result, but it was enough. And so the idea with triage mode is as soon as it finds something that will flag it as blocked, it'll stop the process. And that's going to reduce your overall compute time because instead of giving you every single detail, even though it already knows it's going to block the file, I'm going to continue to give you more results. That's going to continue to use time and resources. It says as soon as I hit a blockable offense, scan's done. So you can see that reduced it way down to 7 seconds. So even then, we're talking a difference of quite a bit when we're looking at static analysis, which for a file like this probably takes around 50 milliseconds for the static analysis process, up to 7. So for a reasonable ratio of files that you're bringing to Kiosk, let's say a standard USB, that's fine. Even if it is 7 seconds per file and you have even a few dozen files or 100 files, that's a reasonable amount of time that you can plug in the USB and then let it run while you're performing other actions potentially, and get a result. But plugging in once again something like an external hard drive and you need to have a full analysis, you need to make that decision on what kind of workflow you want to apply to that. So that's why it's a good idea too sometimes to have multiple essentially options, workflow types for different kinds of removable media with kiosk as well. And kiosk is a really good example of how you can have the same solution, the same use case, but have wildly different expectations for what you can expect to scan media. Because an external hard drive and a 2 gigabyte USB are both removable media. But the amount of time we can expect to scan something with a full sandbox analysis process on each of those is, we're talking wildly different times. So that needs to be put into consideration, especially if you are operating and managing those solutions, to know which is going to be the best case for those situations. And if we have a file in this particular use case that was missed by the antivirus engines, and you are able to use Sandbox as that secondary scan, because by default, when you enable Sandbox for core in this embedded Sandbox version, by default, it's not going to scan files that were allowed. It's designed to be that additional analysis setup, and we do that so that people that are enabling it for the first time aren't surprised by a huge change in processing time. They should know that they're making that change in the workflow. So in the workflow, you're saying, we can actually take a look at this. By default, it's actually threat found or suspicious, or failed to scan, not scan. Basically, I didn't get to scan with the antivirus engine, so I still want to run the sandbox. So is it a suspicious file or is it threat found? So there's some kind of negative already associated with that file, and I want to get additional information. That's the default setting for file scan because it's less disruptive if you aren't fully knowing what to expect. But the way that we set it in our demo to demonstrate that you want that second layer is, if I'm going to block it with the antivirus engines already, then I'm not going to spend the resources to scan it. However, if it's not scanned, I want to have a zero trust policy and have no threat found as the condition in which I want to scan the file. In which case, with your question is, will Sandbox help detect that for files that are missed? And that's exactly the use case where, even though the antivirus engine said the multi-scan said this file was clean, I want to get that essentially a second opinion, if you will, for the Sandbox to run. And the nice thing is that you can drop files that are blocked by default so that they don't get processed in that sense. Okay, so like have different user account with various workflows. Normal user work could be quick, where admin would be detailed. Yeah, exactly. The different workflows, uh, different uh, different execution mechanisms that you want to scan with kiosk. There are questions in the QA section. Thank you. I will take a look at those. Can this OPSWAT metascan be implemented on the email gateway server? So this is an important question actually with the Metadefender products. Metadefender ICAP server, Metadefender email gateway security, Metadefender kiosk. All of these solutions are talking to this product that we're looking at right here on the screen. So even though it's delivered as it is delivered, it is a full solution, a full offered solution. The technology that's actually used to scan emails, to scan USBs, to scan ICAP traffic, HTTP traffic converted to ICAP traffic, it's all going to core. It's all going to Metadefender core for the actual multi-scanning analysis. So that's really the biggest purpose of those solutions, is to bring our technologies out to those types of data flow, that types of data transfer. Email is a type of data transfer. USBs are a type of data transfer. So those products help bring our core scanning technologies to those solutions. So yes, Metascan absolutely is used with the email gateway security product. And I'll go ahead and mark this as completed. Hello, I recently encountered an incident. Can I share the suspected doc for education purposes? If you have an incident with our products, then please go to myopswat.com to look at the support page, raise a ticket with our support cases. If you're having a cybersecurity incident and you're looking to report that, you should look at proper channels for um, security incidences. At OPSWAT, we deal with file incidents. So let's say that you have a file that you want to share. That is something that we are very interested in. So what you can do is go to metadefender.com, upload the file, and then in the community tab, make a vote. And then what you can do is vote that file as malicious, and then that'll help everyone with the reputation as well. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's get back to chat. All right, can you please explain the workflow once again? Can it be set to run sandbox if AV scan says no threat detected? Yes. So it's important to note with the sandbox technology and the AV technology, we are running out of time, so I'm gonna try to answer this question quickly. It's important to know with the AV technology and sandbox technology, most of the tools in MetaDefender Core are happening asynchronously. They're just going to do their actions on the file without needing to wait for other components. Because there's four antivirus engines, they're not going to wait for each other to to scan. They're not waiting. It's not a sequential scan. They're all going to scan the file at the same time. Same thing with the deep CDR. If that's enabled for the file, it's going to work on the sanitization process alongside the malware analysis process. However, sandboxing happens after because we need to wait for the result based on the configurations that we set here in the workflow. So we can choose when to scan a file based on our needs. If we have the time and we have the ability, it is always best to run the sandbox, even in the rapid scan mode, in the triage rapid scan mode, um, because we're applying a whole nother layer of dynamic analysis to our entire data workflow. But realistically, we need to understand what we're scanning and how many files there are in those workflows. And that's really where the cybersecurity architecture concept comes into place because using our solutions, you need to know what you're using it for and what problem you're solving. And whenever possible, you want to scan files with Sandbox because it gives you the next layer. So, based on the configurations, we can choose to say here, I think it'll be a little easier if I remove some of these other ones so you can see. Really, none of these really matter. The biggest things that are relevant to our demonstration here is that we can either say we want to run the file if there's no threat found or if there's a threat found. We could do both, but then we'd scan everything and then what's the point of the multi-scan? So if we want to scan it when there's a threat found, we're saying if the antivirus engines detect this file as a threat, then I want to scan it. Now, why would we do that? We would do that because we want to be doubly sure it's not a false positive or understand more forensic information about the threat that our antivirus engines found. When would I want to do it the other way? Well, when I do no threat found. Well, now I'm saying if my antivirus engines scan the file and they block it, then I'm not going to scan it with Sandbox because I have no reason to because I'm already blocking it with the static analysis. I already know that those antivirus companies updated their database, they logged this malware, it's detected. I don't need to get more information about this file. However, I'm going to scan everything they approve because I want that next layer of dynamic analysis. And that's when you start dealing with the compute resources and the timing that it's going to take in order to apply that level of technology. But ultimately, that's your best defense against 0 days because now we're not solely relying on the update process of the signature definitions of the antivirus companies. We're letting them do their work for detecting known threats, and everything else, that's why it's zero trust. We don't trust the fact that they say there's no threats because we know that that's possible, uh, that there's a file that didn't make it through that process yet, or it's not updated yet, or it's a true 0 day and you're the first target of that particular malware attack. We're running that through Sandbox to get that higher level of certainty that that file is safe. So it's the balance of timing, what kind of data workflow, um, how much compute resources can we provide, and security, the depth of security, really. And one of the really cool things that we can also do is associate a sanitization as well. Because sanitization happens faster than sandboxing, we can also say, well, I'm only going to scan this file as sandboxed if there's no threat found and if it wasn't sanitized for some reason. So if I enable sanitization on all the 130 or 150 file types, whatever it is, and that's my process to say only sanitized files enter my organization, then I can save some time and compute resources by relying on sanitization first. And if for whatever reason sanitization doesn't happen or fails, then I run the sandbox. So you're giving yourself two layers as long as the sanitization process is applicable for that particular workflow. So you're looking, okay, what's the fastest possible way to get this file through? I scan it through Sandbox, through multi-scan with the static analysis. If it's blocked, I'm done. Okay, it's allowed. Well, now let's take a look at the sanitization result. File sanitized. Great, I'll use the sanitized version. Oh, well, if it didn't sanitize, or if it's not a supported file type, then I run it through Sandbox. So you're getting the order of time and compute resources to use Sandbox as the catch-all for those situations as well, and that'll help with your overall data workflow also. So really gives you a lot of flexibility on how you want to implement that. All right, we have time to answer one more question. How does OPSWAT Metadefender Core work against rootkits attacks, knowing the capabilities of such attacks to modify forensic and monitoring tools, making them difficult to detect? That's a really good question. So for those in the audience who haven't heard of rootkits are essentially they're often disguised as drivers on your system because drivers are such a low kernel level software that they're used to mask other malware typically. So a rootkit gets installed in your system, usually through some vulnerability, and it's used to then deploy more effective malware doing other tasks and mask that malware so that your local antivirus systems aren't detected. That's a general concept of a rootkit. Now, the cool thing about the Metadefender core process is that it's not a locally run system. It's not an endpoint scanning solution. It's not like Windows Defender or Windows Security running on your laptop. It's designed to be fed files from all kinds of data workflows, whether that's through your email or through internet traffic or through your cloud storage or through USBs. So rootkits themselves aren't being used, can't be used really, to mask those files because in those workflows, they're getting fed from external sources. And if you're using something like the OPSWAT client, that software is locally installed. And if there was some kind of component that's hiding things from the OPSWAT client, ultimately, the OPSWAT client can check things like did your local antivirus have any detections lately? Well, if you have a rootkit installed, your local antivirus isn't going to show any detections. But what the OPSWAT client can do is it can send all of your files running in active memory out to be scanned with something like Metadefender Core. And if those files are associated with running processes that are like rootkits keeping those applications hidden, then you'll actually get those results because they're being processed somewhere outside of your local endpoint. So, really good question. I hope that was a good note to end on. We are out of time today, but I really appreciate everybody joining us for the session today. I did promise that we have a promo code. So, the promo code for 75% off, which will be available in about 10 minutes after this webinar. It's 70% off all of the associate courses at opswatacademy.com. So you can use the promo. The promo is 0 day, one word. I'll write it in the chat. Promo code is 0 day, all caps, 0 day. So in about 10 minutes, that code will be active. 75% off all associate courses. And then all of you that are here will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the session. Do note that the recording will be available in 7 days because this promo code is only for you guys. And this promo code 0 days will be available for 7 days. So we post the recording 7 days after this webinar so that you have the time, your exclusive promo code that you have from this session. And then 7 days from now, you'll get an email with a link to the recording. So please record the promo code, and it's just for you guys, so that those that come back to watch the recording later, this is just a special treat for you. All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for your time. I'm Nate Medeiros once again, and we do these webinars monthly. So keep a lookout for the next one, and look forward to seeing you again. All right. Thank you, everybody.